As 2020 has finally come to an end and 2021 has just recently begun, I wonder if you have taken some time to think through a New Year's resolution. Now, maybe you're the kind of person for which New Year's resolutions don't really resonate at all, you don't really give them much mind. Or maybe you're someone like myself who has the unfortunate tendency of thinking through way too many New Year's resolutions and having aspirations and goals that no human being could feasibly accomplish in a given calendar year. Well, depending on where you find yourself, I want us to land somewhere in the middle of the spectrum today as we consider what David says in Psalm chapter 27, verse 4. Now, although this psalm isn't written as a New Year's resolution poem or psalm, I think what David suggests in this verse has a lot to tell us about the posture and disposition that we can have as we approach this new year. The truth is, many of us may have many noteworthy aspirations or goals for the year ahead. Maybe you want to eat more healthily, or you want to exercise more, or read more, or something related to navigating life in the pandemic. And although all of these things are noteworthy and they're worthy things to aspire to, today David is going to show us a holy simplicity by seeking after just one thing. Now, with that in mind, instead of just looking at my face and me talking about it, I thought we would try something a little different by actually looking at the text of Scripture together. So let's do that, jumping into Psalm chapter 27, verse 4. David writes, "One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple." Now, there's a few things that I want us to notice as we consider this passage together. Notice again that of all the different things that we might aspire to, David himself included, he says that there's just one thing. There's one thing that he's asked of the Lord. I want us to pay a close attention to the verbs that David uses in this particular verse. He says that the one thing he has in mind is something that he's ultimately asked of the Lord. In other words, David isn't just setting out to accomplish this particular goal on his own, through his own strength or through his own means. In fact, he recognizes it's something that he needs God's direct help for, something that he needs God to intervene and to accomplish on his behalf. And yet notice that David says that not only has he asked of the Lord, but he's also seeking. The thing that he's asked for is that which he will seek after. In other words, there's a partnership taking place here. David's describing not simply praying for or asking for something, but actually seeking after the very thing that he's praying for as well. I'm reminded in this particular verse of Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 to 9, where Jesus talks about asking, seeking, and knocking. There's this pattern of growing intensity. With that in mind, I want to encourage you to consider the way that prayer is central to what David describes for us in this passage. As David thinks about maybe his New Year resolution, for lack of a better word, he notes that that is going to be rooted and grounded in prayer. That the thing he most desires is something that he will be praying for, something that he will be asking God to bring about in his life, something that he will then be seeking after in partnership with that prayer. And yet, what is it? What is the one thing that David is asking for and seeking after? Well, he tells us in this next part. He says the one thing that he's asking for, that he's seeking after, is that he may dwell. That he may dwell, notice, in the house of the Lord. This Hebrew verb here, dwell, is the verb yasav. It can also be translated to remain, to abide, or literally to inhabit. That's why your translation, if you're reading, for example, the NLT, will say that David is asking that he would live in the house of the Lord. David's describing wanting to spend, notice, all the days of his life. A constant, ongoing, continual experience of being in God's house. Now, of course, in an Old Testament context and in David's day, the house of the Lord was a phrase which would refer to the tabernacle, the place of worship and of sacrifice in the midst of the people of Israel where God's presence dwelt. And later the tabernacle would become replaced by the temple, which David's son Solomon would be involved in building. And yet what I want us to see in terms of the connection of this passage to our lives and to our experience of Christ today is that the house of the Lord is significant because it's the place where the Lord dwells. It's the place of God's presence. In other words, what David is asking for, what he is seeking after more than anything else, is that he would live in God's presence, that he would dwell there, that he would abide there. And yet notice further that David wants to do something specific in God's presence. He mentions two things in the next part of this verse. Firstly, he says that he wants to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord. He wants to gaze upon God's beauty. Though the word gaze, even in English, it refers to something much more than just looking at. It refers to steadily and intently gazing upon something, looking at something with a sense of admiration or affection. I wonder if you can recall the last time in your life that you gazed upon something with that kind of intentionality, that sort of steady focus. I think of moments where I've gazed upon a beautiful sunset or a starlit sky, or visiting a museum and standing in front of a painting that's just absolutely beautiful. You could spend an entire afternoon studying it and considering the use of color, the brushstrokes, the way the artist has brought together this particular composition. David says in this passage that he wants to dwell in God's house, to live in God's presence in order that he might gaze upon the beauty of the Lord. This verb in Hebrew, or this word rather in Hebrew, can be translated the pleasantness or the kindness. David wants to intentionally gaze upon or behold God's goodness, his beauty. And then as he does that, he wants to inquire. He wants to inquire in God's temple. Your translation might say to meditate upon. In other words, David describes this practice of intentional contemplation where he's dwelling in God's presence, where his eyes and his mind are directed towards God, and he's meditating on his character, on his goodness, on his faithfulness, his mercy, and his grace. This is what David is ultimately asking for, and it's what he is seeking after, the one thing. And so as we enter 2021, I want to encourage you to consider, what does it look like to make this your one thing? What if all of us made our focus more than anything else this year on seeking God's presence, on abiding in him? That as Jesus says in John 15, we would abide in him. We would dwell and remain in him. Surely there are plenty of other things which require our attention and other priorities that God himself wants us to set ourselves to in this coming year. But I would suggest to you that David hits the nail on the head when he says that more than anything, his first priority, the thing that he desires more than anything else, is to be in God's presence. Consider what it looks like for you to be in God's presence today. David describes wanting to be in the house of the Lord. Now, for a non-Levite in Israel, that's a way of saying he wants to have ready, ongoing access to God's sanctuary, that he can go there and worship. And yet today we find ourselves in a context where, for at least the foreseeable future in this year, we won't be able to gather together for public worship. And yet, nevertheless, can I encourage you by saying that the presence of God is something that we have full and ready access to today. That we also can make this our one thing, to seek Jesus, to abide in his presence. Now, there are a number of ways that we do so, but if I can suggest just two to you this year, it is firstly to take up afresh and anew the practice of prayer. That you would make time in the midst of your day and your week to simply get alone, or maybe with your family, come together for a time of prayer. A time where you can turn off the distractions of devices and notifications and schedules and everything else and just be still, be silent, meditate in God, talk to him, inquire in his presence, as David describes. And then secondly, in cooperation with that you would make an intentional effort this year to seek God in his word. That as we open the pages of Scripture and think about the story that it tells that culminates in Jesus, we would see there the beauty of God on display, his character, his heart on display for us and for all of creation. That like David, we would gaze upon God's beauty in the story of his word. We would meditate and inquire on him. Make this your one thing in 2021.